Alright, YouTube, it's time to talk about free speech because some individuals appear not to actually understand the concept of the First Amendment. And this even goes to people within the media, by the way. If you look at them in the wake of this failed terrorist attack in Texas, some people appear to believe that the way to deal with the issue is to simply clamp down on free speech, sort of censor what people can say in order to prevent violence. I've pointed out on my previous video that simply doing that would not actually stop a single instance of Islamic terrorism, because the Islamic fanatics, the ones that are actually doing the attacking, do not care if you're respectful and nice to them. They will kill you anyway. They really don't care. It's really more about, do you accept their specific brand of Islam? So the idea that this attack would have been stopped by not having the Draw Muhammad Day thing is ridiculous, because these were actual militant individuals with their weapons all ready to go. They would have attacked something else eventually anyway. The fact that this event happened to be heavily guarded is the reason why we didn't see, any loss of life beyond the two shooters actually getting killed. It wouldn't have stopped the attacks there. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point is that free speech is free speech, and it ceases to be free speech when it is regulated. The government has already been barred, by the way, by Supreme Court decision. I'll try to link the case in the description if I can find it, because there are quite a few Supreme Court decisions to go through. The federal government cannot convert rights into privileges constitutionally. It is not able to do so. The right to free speech is not a privilege. It is an inherent intrinsic right that all citizens happen to have. You can consider this the result of divine inspiration, as the founders probably did, or you can consider it a recognition of a person's own sovereignty over themselves and their ideas and what they happen to say, or you can look at it as a function of equality. That is, that all citizens essentially, because they are equal in the way the law treats them, should have the right to state their opinion any way they want. There are some legal and acceptable regulations of speech, and what the fuck's his name? Chris Cuomo, or some CNN anchor on Twitter a couple days ago essentially attempted to say that hate speech is not covered by the First Amendment. He was then quickly satirized and rebuffed on this, because people generally know that's not actually the case and it is protected by the First Amendment. He then quickly attempted to scale back what he had said and say, oh no, I was talking about fighting words. Well, that is one exception to the First Amendment. However, his original post said nothing about that. The thing is, there are people in this country who really do want to convert the First Amendment into a privilege so that they can control public discourse, therefore they can control people's understanding of the world. They want to denigrate it and make it more along the lines of the sort of free speech that you would see in any marginally developed nation in the world, where it's free with exceptions, and significant exceptions, I might add. For instance, you might not be able to criticize a religion because blasphemy. You might not be able to criticize the ruling party because sedition. We had the Alien and Sedition Act under John Adams in this country. He was the second president of the United States. It wasn't, the country was still in infancy. And we already had the Alien and Sedition Act, which I suggest you Google. Clearly unlawful, clearly contravened the First Amendment, but it was practiced anyway. And people were pissed about it, and of course Thomas Jefferson takes over and does away with all that bullshit, for which he's remembered fairly fondly. As well as for the Louisiana Purchase. Good going, Thomas. You made a good one there. That was a pretty good decision. About as good as Seward's icebox, really, when you think about the economic surplus it achieved. Anyways, back to the actual point of the video. Yes, the First Amendment protects hate speech. You may not like it, you may think it's objectionable, but the very term hate speech is not found in the Constitution. It is an artificially constructed blanket term, created far later, to essentially categorize certain types of speech that may be exacerbating factors within crime. They may be treated differently in regards to organizations being non-profits or something like that, but it has absolutely nothing to do with denigrating the constitutional protections of such groups. A hate group can, for instance, form a militia under the Second Amendment. a hate group can speak its mind freely. There are limits to that, and I will then say the limits. They have the same right to privacy as any other group of citizens would have. You do not need to support that. You do not need to not oppose it. But they have that right nonetheless. That is the manner in which the country has functioned, should function, and was meant to function in the first place. The idea was that simply because somebody happens to say something objectionable, well, how do you then objectively determine that what they are saying is hateful or vile or wrong, or, we should outlaw this kind of speech? Because really, when people on the left clamor for sort of a clampdown on free speech to not offend Islamists or to not offend insert other group here, what they are saying is remarkably similar to the sort of like, let's ban this book, let's ban this, let's ban gays from doing X, Y, and Z, that you've really found among the evangelicals in this country on the other side for the last 100 years. They're essentially equitable. And the common feature is that there's no constitutional basis to actually craft any of these forms of censorship, and many times they fail to be implemented on that very token. As far as exceptions to free speech go, there are only a few of them. They're relatively straightforward. Fighting words is one of them. Essentially, you can't walk up to somebody and say, well, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to punch you out, I'm going to grind your testicles off, I'm going to rape your whore wife and burn your fucking neighborhood to the ground. That would be considered fighting words. You are proposing a threat to another individual actively. You are threatening them. It is a criminal threat. It could be perceived itself as a form of violent behavior. If you walk up to somebody and say, I'm going to murder you, that other person in I would assume most jurisdictions in the country can clock you in the fucking head and knock you out cold and have done nothing wrong by virtue of having done so, because you have essentially presented yourself as a direct, credible threat to that individual. Credible threats in general would not be covered by the First Amendment. For instance, you could, and it has to be a credible threat. I've made this distinction before. If a person were to say, well, I'm going to fly to the moon and arm it with nuclear weapons and fire them down on the United States, ha ha ha, hail Osama bin Laden, that would not be a credible threat, because obviously you're not actually going to fly to the moon, build an array of nuclear weapons, and fire them back at the United States. It may be suspect, what you're saying may be ludicrous, it may be stupid, it may be violent and insane, it may even be genocidal in the most open manner, but it's not a credible threat. If you make a credible threat against a person, place, or thing, that is potentially criminal. If you say, well, I am going to attack this business, I am going to attack this person, I am going to steal from this bank, that would be a criminal threat. Terroristic threats would follow along with those. That would be basically the same thing. I don't exactly know what aggravating factors would be determined necessary in order to differentiate that from just a regular criminal threat to a terroristic threat. I'm not actually really sure what the differentiation is there. Another would be slander. You're willfully and deliberately attempting to destroy somebody's reputation or life, or break up their relationship, or cause them to lose their job or something by saying something that's patently false and which you know to be patently false. Libel, stuff like that, in a literary form. Those would be the exceptions to free speech. There is no exception within free speech for anything else. The idea that by virtue of, well, we may piss off some terrorists and so we shouldn't be able to say this, is not in the Constitution. It's not found anywhere else in our laws, because the difference between that and a criminal threat is this. When you're making a criminal threat, a reasonable person will construe what you have said according to whatever judiciary is determining your case, will have determined that a reasonable, sane individual will find what you have said to be a legitimate, credible, present threat against them. If you're holding up a baseball bat, walking up behind someone, you say, hey, turn around, I'm going to absolutely pound your skull flat into the pavement, that's a credible threat. And any reasonable, sane person will fear for their life in such a situation. But a reasonable, sane person will not react to Draw Muhammad Day, or Blaspheme Jesus Day, or Gay Day, or any of these other things with attempts to harm other people. It isn't a threat to those individuals, so credible threat or something like that's out the window. It's certainly not terroristic in nature. You could consider it disrespectful. You can consider it, if you choose, in bad taste, if you happen to think that it's in bad taste. I personally don't care. I see it as regular satire. You can choose to find it objectionable. But a reasonable person, including most likely you, is not going to suddenly arm themselves and go spray people with gunfire as a result of Draw Muhammad Day. A reasonable, average, sane individual, possessed of their normal mental faculties, is not going to suddenly start butchering people because somebody drew Muhammad. That's not a reasonable response to what has happened, and therein lies the litmus test, really, where this law is applied. You have to assume that a reasonable person would find it so objectionable as to be threatening to them or to their livelihood. Well, drawing Muhammad does not threaten anybody, and it does not threaten anybody's livelihood. It would be differentiated from if somebody were to call up a mosque and say, hey, I'm going to bomb your mosque. Or, somebody was posting online, they're like, I will take this gun and I will kill 10,000 Muslims. That could be a terroristic threat, yes. But simply drawing Muhammad, the only law that it breaks is some blasphemy law from a text written over 1,000 years ago, which is not part of our secular legal system. Therefore, it is unenforceable. The government does not have the capability to regulate that style of speech. It is constitutionally blocked from doing so. This extends beyond simply saying things. A lot of people think that free speech and free press means you have the right to say what you want physically, like I'm speaking right now, or you have the right, if you're a member of the press, to do X, Y, and Z. Like Feinstein has suggested cracking down on independent bloggers and journalists who are not accredited by some mainstream media source. Clearly, she doesn't understand the tenets of the term press as they were used in the mid-1700s. Back then, the press was quite literally a printing press. It didn't mean accredited media. It didn't mean you run a newspaper. It didn't mean you are some sort of reporter. It meant quite literally you have had something pressed with paper and ink on a printing press. This would apply to any book created, any magazine, any sort of billet or pamphlet that's handed out that isn't otherwise criminal. It advocates terrorism or something, that might be a different issue. Anything you say, anything presented by any media member or in any electronic form by any citizen, whether they're a journalist, accredited or unaccredited, or whether they're a member of any media organization at all. When I am engaged in writing books and putting them on Amazon, I am participating in the press. Because it is literary material. It is a literary form of speech. It is explicitly protected under the First Amendment. By that same token, this is why the government does not generally attempt, except in some extreme situations, and it's always unsuccessful anyway, to crack down and censor literary material either. Music could be covered under this, under the First Amendment, and is regarded as being covered as so. Art, any expression of opinion or thought in any medium is protected under the First Amendment. It is all free of censorship. In this country, it is totally unacceptable for the government or for any other body to attempt to limit people's right to speak, to write, to communicate with one another, or to communicate with the masses in general through any medium. It is unacceptable. Any sort of censorship of the internet would fall under the same umbrella. Unless otherwise criminal activity is going on. Now, personally, I think most of the so-called criminal activity that they would actually institute such censorships for shouldn't be instituted anyway. For instance, like the drug war, going after Silk Road, or something like that, or going after torrenting sites under some vague copyright law that really doesn't make sense to begin with. That's my feelings, though. You'd have to get the Supreme Court or a federal judge or something involved to actually determine that on a legal basis. But as far as existing case law goes, the First Amendment is not vague. It's quite explicit. And there are many implicit coverages of, for instance, the electronic medium. When the First Amendment was written, didn't exist. There was no internet back in the 1700s, although I can look back and say Washington probably would have had a pretty good time trolling the British if it had existed at the time. I can just see, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson half out of their minds drunk on Twitter, taking to Twitter to go attack the British. There would have been no American Revolution. There just would have been the American troll shitstorm. Anyways, no. Hate speech is explicitly protected by the First Amendment because the First Amendment explicitly protects all forms of communication and speech and printing and all of these things in all situations, unless it is specifically outlawed under other purposes. But we can't have anti-blasphemy laws in the United States. There is no right to not be offended by what others say. If you are offended, then the proper response from a sane individual would be, don't pay any mind to it, or if you choose, refute what you are hearing. For you might envision a Christian and an atheist fighting. Well, the proper response, I've always been on this side myself, the proper response isn't to try to shut down debate, it's to improve your debate skills and win the debate. There are other people who don't hold this view, and where you see these groups losing support, these are primarily the groups that are going for more censorship and more crackdowns on speech. Thus, you have what we envision as the modern far left, as well as the modern far right, attempting to do basically the same thing as we speak. The far left does not want people criticizing Islam. It doesn't want people criticizing any minority community in the country, and the far right doesn't want anyone criticizing the church. Whatever church they happen to be members of, often a Baptist or Pentecostal fucking congregation. They don't want anyone to hear about the occult. They tried to censor Harry Potter all the time. Now, looking back, does anybody really anymore believe the arguments that were made 10 years ago about Harry Potter and how it caused people to become occultists and worship the devil and stuff? Of course not. Even the religious Christians don't have a problem with Harry Potter really anymore. But at the time, they made the argument that because it was potentially damaging to young minds, that it shouldn't be in schools and it shouldn't be in libraries. And they were routinely unsuccessful at actually blocking this material. I would say the First Amendment explicitly protects the rights of people under 18 as well to access whatever literary material they should choose to access as well. There's no differentiation made in the U.S. Constitution. There's no actual differentiation made for any legal purpose between someone who's 18 and someone who's 14 as far as their right to free speech. It also makes no differentiation with regards to the Second Amendment or anything else. It simply does not make that differentiation. There are plenty of places where if you're accompanied by an adult, you may be 9, 10 years old and carrying a firearm. And nobody cares, and largely it goes on without issue. In some jurisdictions, some states, this came up in the Supreme Court's own oral arguments on gay marriage. Like in the state of Oklahoma, a 12-year-old can marry in the state of Oklahoma. Do we find this perhaps a little strange? Maybe. I mean, if they're marrying another 12-year-old, probably not an issue, but it could be a little odd, a little dubious, a little bit strange. But ultimately, the Constitution doesn't make a differentiation as far as constitutional rights based on age. No, I don't think people are arguing that someone who is, not yet cognating at an adult level is necessarily fully capable of making use of their capability to consent, for one thing, that's the biggest issue, or also to enjoy some of their constitutional rights as they may be applied. But you've got to understand, 18 is largely an arbitrary age that is given primarily for things like tobacco and joining the U.S. military, or driving on your own or whatever, however the states may do it. Biologically speaking, it's not nearly the actual approximate age at which full adult cognition begins, so you do have that gray area there as well. And I would say a lot of times the government would try to censor material to keep it from falling into the hands of somebody who's arbitrarily labeled a minor. Rap music, metal, some book that's been rated 18 plus or something. But that's a modern day artificial legal distinction. It is not an antiquated legal distinction made directly in the Constitution any more than the Constitution contains a prohibition of hate speech, because let's face it, while you may find it objectionable, ultimately it is still protected. I choose to believe, I've said this before as well, that if you have an open, uncensored, absolutely free public discourse, what you tend to get over time are good ideas rising to the top and bad ideas floundering. Assuming no intrusion from let's say, biased outside groups using spam bots on the internet or something like that, or mass marketing, a bunch of propaganda. The tendency over time is good ideas rise, bad ideas fall, innovation and progress are thus created. That is generally what we see as the case. It's almost like evolution. When you begin to stifle that, you get a lack of progress. You slow things down or reverse them altogether, and you get regression in some cases. And so I think it's very dangerous. But thankfully, courts past and present have not been too happy about the idea of the government increasing things like censorship, increasing any sort of control over free speech. I cannot honestly see it happening. I think this is a completely dead issue because I can't see any situation in our current era or in any time in the immediate or possibly long since now future. I can't see any situation in which people would actually advocate giving up their actual free speech. I think this would be just as unpopular among the left as it would the right. I don't see a danger from it, but I think the real danger is allowing the few nutballs that are actually suggesting it to get away with suggesting it without repercussions, especially in the online world. That is like Cuomo or whatever his name was from Kyle or Chris or something like that on Twitter, the CNN anchor. Apparently thought nobody was going to call him out on a blatantly false statement. His statement was obviously and completely false. He then attempted to backtrack it to fool people into thinking he had said something totally different, which he hadn't actually said. He mentioned nothing about fighting words. If he had, his statement would have essentially been correct. But the thing is, it wouldn't make sense in the context anyway, because fighting words extends far beyond just hate groups. You don't have to be in the Ku Klux Klan to issue fighting words that would be considered illegal. That is not the way in which that system works. So yes, free speech is essentially absolute. The suggestion of censoring speech that happens to be objectionable or offensive then would force the legal system essentially to determine what constitutes a valid determination that the speech is actually objectionable in the first place, and they can't actually do that. It would be impossible for them to do so. The only exception really is those fighting words, and again, it would have to be the judgment of a sane, rational individual that there was an actual threat posed by what was being said. I don't think anybody can construe drawing Muhammad as something that would set off a rational individual. Instead, it's not even going to set off the average Islamic individual who might object to it. It's going to set off a handful of Islamofascists. But then again, if you were trolling people online, you could accidentally troll a cartel member and cause them to come after you and behead you in defense of their honor or pride or something. That doesn't mean that what you're saying would be construed by the average sane individual as being objectionable to the level that it would pose a threat to them. The Supreme Court has already weighed in on this long ago. The government cannot convert rights into privileges, specifically because if it began to do so, the Constitution would no longer have any meaning. That's what's held off gun control, it's what's held off censorship, it's held off all of these things. About the only thing that slipped through is like the drug war, which really, in a way, is kind of prohibited by the right to privacy within the Constitution, if you choose to construe it that way. But no, I can't see this going anywhere, which is good. But as for the CNN anchor on Twitter who suggested that hate speech wasn't protected by the First Amendment, he's clearly and utterly wrong, got called out on it, lied about it afterwards, said, "Oh, I didn't say that. I said fighting words." No, you actually didn't. You said hate speech. Two totally different issues, again, because you don't need to be in the Klan or a militant, black Islamist Nation of Islam or something in order to use fighting words. So I hope people take that to mind. Any threat to the First Amendment that is seen should be rebuffed immediately. It should be fought into the ground if necessary. Thankfully, such threats to the First Amendment, even the government trolls aren't going to advocate for fucking that, because then they'd be essentially shooting themselves in the foot, because they want to go on Twitter and rant all day too. They're just as obsessed over these things now as the general population. I honestly can't see a day in which even the political elite would really make this an issue. But the fact is, we do have to fight against the handful of people who might. just in case, even if it's not a particularly compelling threat. It's just like gun control. They're not going to come for your guns, but you want to stop the possibility of a slow slide towards the same ultimate ending defeat of the Constitution. That's about all. Peace out.